When my coffee ruined the most expensive suit on campus, I braced for the explosion. It was Vivienne Ashford, the untouchable ice queen. She was supposed to destroy me right there in the dead silent library. Instead, she just stared, her cold gray eyes tracking my every move. Then, she whispered 5 words that terrified me far more than any threat. "I know who you are." And just like that, I became her obsession. The coffee cup slipped from Grace's fingers at exactly 2:47 on a Tuesday afternoon, and the entire library seemed to stop breathing with it. She had been reaching across the table to grab her notebook, her elbow catching the rim of the paper cup in that clumsy, inevitable way that only happened in her worst daydreams. The lid popped off. The dark liquid arced through the air like a slow-motion disaster, and then it landed, steaming and spreading, across the crisp white sleeve of the most expensive suit she had ever seen in her life. The suit belonged to Vivienne Ashford. Grace's stomach dropped into her shoes. She knew who Vivienne was, of course. Everyone knew who Vivienne was. The student council president, the business school's golden girl, the heir to the Ashford family fortune, the woman who walked through campus like she owned it, which she probably would one day. The Ice Queen, people called her, the woman who had never once been seen smiling at anyone who wasn't a donor or a dean. And now, Grace had just poured an entire iced caramel latte down her arm. The library was dead silent. Grace could feel the weight of 40 pairs of eyes pressing into her back, could hear someone's sharp intake of breath from 3 tables away. She waited for the explosion, waited for the cold, cutting words, the dismissal, the threat of expulsion, the kind of scene that would follow her for the rest of her college career. Vivienne looked at her. That was all. She just looked at Grace, her head tilted slightly, her dark eyes unreadable. The silence stretched. Grace's heart hammered so loudly she was sure the other woman could hear it. She opened her mouth to apologize, to grovel, to say anything, but the words died in her throat. Because Vivienne wasn't looking at her like she was angry at listeners, like she was looking at Grace like she was seeing her, really seeing her, and that was somehow 1,000 times more terrifying. "I'm so sorry," Grace finally managed, her voice coming out in a breathless rush. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to. Let me get you some napkins, or I can pay for the dry cleaning. It's fine," Vivienne said. Her voice was calm, completely unnervingly calm. She didn't look down at her ruined sleeve, didn't flinch at the coffee still dripping onto the polished floor. She just kept looking at Grace with that strange, focused attention, like Grace was a puzzle she was trying to solve. Grace started again, already reaching for the napkins on the table, her hands shaking so badly she nearly knocked over her own water bottle. "I said it's fine," Vivienne repeated. And then, impossibly, her lips curved into something that might have been a smile. It was small and fleeting, and gone almost before Grace could register it, but it was there. "It's just a suit. It's just a suit." The words were so absurd, so completely at odds with everything Grace knew about Vivienne Ashford, that she could only stare in disbelief. The Vivienne Ashford of campus legend would have eviscerated anyone who so much as wrinkled her designer clothes. The Vivienne Ashford who had reportedly reduced a junior to tears for being 2 minutes late to a meeting. The Vivienne Ashford who had a reputation for icy perfection that bordered on obsessive. And yet, here she was, soaked in coffee, telling Grace it was fine. "Is there something on my face?" Vivienne asked, and there was a hint of dry amusement in her voice now. Grace realized she was staring. She snapped her mouth shut, felt her cheeks burn. "No, I'm really sorry. I should have been more careful. I'll replace the suit. You'll do nothing of the sort." Vivienne finally reached for the napkins herself, dabbing at her sleeve with an air of almost bored indifference. "Accidents happen. It's not worth making a scene over." But she said it in a way that made Grace wonder if she meant something else entirely. "It's not worth making a scene over, because you're not worth making a scene over." Or maybe, "It's not worth making a scene over, because I'm used to things being ruined." Grace couldn't tell. She was too flustered, too aware of the eyes still watching them, too caught up in the strange electric tension crackling between them. "I'm Grace," she blurted out, because she didn't know what else to do. "Grace Mitchell. I'm a literature major. I'm a junior. "I know who you are," Vivienne said. The words landed like a stone in still water. Grace's breath caught. "You know who I am?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Vivienne didn't answer. She just looked at Grace for one more long, unreadable moment, and then she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the library floor with perfect, measured precision. The crowd of onlookers parted for her like she was Moses, and she didn't look back once. Grace stood frozen in the middle of the library, surrounded by the wreckage of her coffee cup and her dignity, watching the Ice Queens retreating back. She didn't know why, but she had the strangest feeling that this wasn't over, that something had just begun, something she couldn't name and couldn't predict, the kind of thing that happened to other people, in other stories, not to quiet literature majors who spent their evenings reading poetry and burning cookies in the dorm kitchen. But as she bent down to clean up the mess, her hands still trembling, she couldn't shake the image of Vivienne's face, the way she had looked at her, the way she had said, "I know who you are," like it meant something, like it meant everything. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Grace went to her classes, sat through lectures she couldn't focus on, ate dinner in the dining hall without tasting a single bite. Her roommate, Maya, asked her what was wrong, and Grace just shook her head and said she was tired. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put into words this strange, unsettling feeling that had taken root in her chest. It was just a coffee spill, just an accident, just a brief, bizarre interaction with the most intimidating woman on campus. And yet, when Grace finally crawled into bed that night, she found herself staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over in her mind. The tilt of Vivienne's head, the curve of her lips, the way her eyes had lingered on Grace's face like she was memorizing it. She fell asleep with the image of those dark, unreadable eyes burned into her mind, and she dreamed of libraries and spilled coffee, and a woman who looked at her like she was being seen for the first time. Across campus, in a penthouse apartment that overlooked the city, Vivienne Ashford stood in front of her bathroom mirror, carefully peeling off her ruined jacket. The coffee stain had dried into an ugly brown blotch on the white fabric, and she should have been furious. She should have been livid. That suit had cost more than most students' monthly rent, but she wasn't angry. She was thinking about Grace Mitchell, the way she had stuttered and fumbled and apologized like the world was ending, the way her hands had shaken as she reached for the napkins, the way she had looked at Vivienne with those wide, earnest eyes, like she genuinely cared about the damage she had done. No one ever apologized to Vivienne like that. They apologized because they were afraid of her, because they wanted something from her, because they knew they were supposed to. But Grace had apologized because she was genuinely sorry, because she was a good person. Vivienne could tell. She had a gift for reading people, for seeing through their masks and their lies and their carefully constructed facades. It was the only way she had survived the cutthroat world of the Ashford family. And when she had looked at Grace Mitchell, she hadn't seen a fawning sycophant or a scheming opportunist. She had seen someone real, someone who, for one brief, shining moment, had looked at Vivienne Ashford like she was just a person. Not a legacy, not an heiress, not a weapon to be wielded, just a person. Vivienne set the ruined jacket aside and reached for her phone. She scrolled through her contacts, past the business associates and the family lawyers and the old classmates who only ever contacted her when they needed something, and stopped at a name she hadn't dialed in months, her mother. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her thumb hovering over the call button. Then she set the phone down with a soft sigh and turned to face her reflection in the mirror. The woman who stared back at her was composed and perfect, and utterly alone. "Take a breath," she murmured to herself, echoing a phrase she'd read somewhere, long ago, in a book she had never told anyone she owned. Just take a breath. She didn't know why she said it. She didn't know why her mind kept drifting back to Grace Mitchell, to those wide, earnest eyes, to the way she had said, "I'm just a literature major," like she was apologizing for her own existence. But she knew, with a soft certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she would see Grace again, and when she did, she would be ready. The email came on a Tuesday morning, sandwiched between a reminder about overdue library books and a notice about the spring poetry reading. Grace almost deleted it without reading past the subject line, but the words "volunteer requirement" stopped her thumb mid-swipe. Because she had never once in 3 years received anything from the student government office. She opened it, scanned the first paragraph, and felt her stomach drop. The spring fundraising gala was in 6 weeks, and the student council was requesting volunteers from every department to assist with logistics. The literature department had been assigned a quota of 3, and Grace Mitchell, apparently, had been selected. She read the sentence 3 times, convinced it was a mistake. Her professor, Dr. Ellis, had emailed her separately to say she had been recommended for the position. Recommended by whom? Grace had no idea. She had never volunteered for anything in her life, unless you counted the time she helped her neighbor carry groceries up 3 flights of stairs. She wanted to say no, she really did. But there was a thing about Grace Mitchell that her friends had learned to recognize. That quiet, stubborn streak that made her show up even when she was terrified. She could not turn down a request without a good reason. And "I'm scared of the student council president" did not feel like a good reason. It felt like the kind of reason that would make Dr. Ellis laugh, gently, and tell her to go anyway. So on Thursday morning, Grace found herself standing in the student council office, clutching a clipboard that had been shoved into her hands before she could even introduce herself. The ruche thing was a controlled chaos of flyers, seating charts, and half-empty coffee cups, and at the center of it all, calm and precise as a surgeon, sat Vivienne Ashford. Vivienne did not look up when Grace entered. She was bent over a spreadsheet, her dark hair pulled back in a low knot, one finger tracing a column of numbers. The custom navy suit was gone, replaced by a simple white blouse and tailored trousers. The coffee stain had vanished with it, and so, apparently, had the version of Vivienne who had stood frozen in the library, staring at Grace like she was something worth reading. This Vivienne was all efficiency. She spoke without looking at anyone, her voice clipped and precise, assigning tasks and deadlines with the cold authority of a general. Grace hovered near the door, feeling very much like a piece of furniture that had been temporarily misplaced. "Mitchell?" Vivienne's voice cut through the hum of conversation, and Grace's head snapped up. Vivienne was finally looking at her, those pale gray eyes unreadable. "You're on the silent auction team? Claire will brief you." Grace opened her mouth to say something, anything, but Vivienne had already turned away, back to her spreadsheet, as if Grace were a checkbox she had just ticked off. Claire, a tall blonde with a sharp smile and a fitness tracker on her wrist, appeared at Grace's elbow. "Welcome to the deep end," she said, not unkindly. "Don't drown." The first week was a blur of spreadsheets and donor lists and silent auction item spreadsheets that seemed to multiply overnight. Grace was given the least glamorous tasks, alphabetizing donation forms, labeling gift baskets, double-checking the spelling of donor names on printed name tags. She did them all without complaint, because that was who she was, and because every time she glanced toward the center of the room, she found Vivienne looking back at her. Not staring. Never that. Just a flicker of attention, a brief pause in the steady stream of commands, a moment where their eyes met and held before Vivienne looked away. It happened so often that Grace began to wonder if she was imagining it. By the end of the second week, the gala was coming together, and Grace had learned 3 things about Vivienne Ashford. 1. She never raised her voice, even when the decorations committee delivered the wrong color of tablecloths. 2. She drank her coffee black, no sugar, and always at the exact same hour of the afternoon. 3. She was the most quietly terrifying person Grace had ever met. It was the silence that got to Grace, the way Vivienne could walk into a room and make it go quiet without saying a word, the way people flinched when she asked a question, as if being noticed by her was somehow a threat, the way no one, not even Claire, who was supposed to be her right hand, ever asked her how she was doing. Grace tried to keep her head down, to stay in her lane, to be the invisible volunteer who alphabetized donation forms and went home, but then came the afternoon of the misplaced donor list and everything changed. The list was gone. Not lost, not misplaced, gone. The master spreadsheet had been overwritten and the only backup had mysteriously corrupted. It was a disaster of epic proportions, because the donor list contained every name, every contact, every promised donation for the gala. And the gala was in 4 weeks. Claire stood in the center of the office, her face white, the corrupted file open on her laptop. "I don't know what happened," she said, for the 5th time. "I saved it this morning. I swear I did." Vivienne stood at the window when her back to the room, her posture perfectly still, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and everyone in the office seemed to shrink into themselves, waiting for the explosion that never came. When Vivienne finally turned, her face was calm, but her eyes were cold. Who had access to the file? No one answered. Grace felt her own breath catch. She had been in the office late the night before, alphabetizing donor name tags. She had seen the file open on Claire's laptop. She had closed the laptop, carefully, without touching anything else. But she had been there, and someone, she realized, had probably seen her. "I had access," she said, before she could stop herself. Every head in the room turned toward her. Claire's eyes widened, whether in surprise or relief, Grace couldn't tell. Vivienne's expression did not change, but something shifted behind those gray eyes, something sharp and questioning. "Explain," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet, dangerous. Grace swallowed. "I was here last night alphabetizing name tags. I saw the file open on your laptop, Claire. I closed it before I left. I didn't open it. I didn't touch anything else. I just closed the laptop, I swear." Claire's face contorted. "You were there? You were the last one in the office?" The accusation hung in the air, unspoken but unmistakable. Grace felt her heart sink, felt the weight of the room pressing down on her. She was the new one, the outsider, the literature major who didn't belong. She opened her mouth to defend herself, but Vivienne spoke first. She didn't do it. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Claire blinked. "Vivienne, she said she was the last one. I said she didn't do it." Vivienne's voice was ice, final and absolute. "Check the version, HH." In story. The file was overwritten at 2:47 a.m. Mitchell was gone by 11. I saw her leave. Grace felt her knees go a little weak. She had no idea Vivienne had been watching her. No idea anyone had been watching her. Vivienne looked at her, and for a fraction of a second, something warm flickered in those cold gray eyes. "You're dismissed, Mitchell. You can finish the name tags tomorrow." Grace nodded, unable to speak, and turned to leave. At the door, she glanced back. Vivienne had already turned away, back to the window, her silhouette sharp against the afternoon light, alone, as always. That night, Grace lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment over and over. Vivienne had defended her. The Ice Queen, the woman who never noticed anyone, had noticed that she left at 11, had watched her, maybe, without her knowing. It should have made Grace feel safer. Instead, it made her feel like she was standing on the edge of something she didn't understand, a quiet, patient trap she was walking into with her eyes wide open. She fell asleep thinking about those gray eyes, about the way they had softened, just for a second, and about the question she was too afraid to ask. Why me? The volunteer room had a particular smell after midnight, a mix of stale coffee, printer ink, and the faint sweetness of the glue sticks Grace had been using for the past 2 hours. She had stayed late to finish the silent auction paddles, and now her fingers were sticky and her back ached from crouching over the table. She stretched, rolled her shoulders, and checked her phone. 11:47 p.m. The campus was quiet, the kind of deep silence that felt almost sacred. She packed up her things and was about to leave when she heard it. A voice, low and strained, coming from the main auditorium, across the hall. Grace froze. She knew that voice. She should have walked away. She knew that, too. But her feet moved on their own, carrying her toward the half-open door of the auditorium, her footsteps silent on the carpeted floor. Through the gap, she saw Vivienne standing near the stage, her back to the door, her phone pressed hard against her ear. Her shoulders were rigid, her free hand gripping the edge of a chair so tightly that her knuckles were white. No, Vivienne was saying, her voice clipped but shaking at the edges. "I told you. I cannot be there this weekend. The donor dinner is... I know what it is. I know what it means. But I am not..." She stopped, listened, and then let out a breath that sounded like it hurt. "You don't understand," she said, quieter now. "I am not just a symbol. I am not just your showpiece. I am a person. I am here. Her voice cracked on the next word, and she did not finish it. She pulled the phone away from her ear, stared at it for a long moment, and then set it down on the chair with a care that seemed to cost her something. Grace's chest tightened. She had never heard Vivienne sound like that. Small. Broken. The Ice Queen, reduced to a voice that trembled in an empty auditorium at midnight. Vivienne did not move. She stood there, facing the stage, her back still turned, and Grace watched as her shoulders began to shake, just slightly, just once, before she forced them still again. This was not Grace's business. She knew that. She was not supposed to see this. But she also knew, with a sudden clarity that made her heart ache, that she could not just walk away and leave Vivienne alone in this dark, empty room. She moved quietly, slipping back to the volunteer room. She grabbed the last cup of coffee from the machine, the one she had been saving for herself, and she found a sticky note and a pen. She wrote 3 words, the only words she could think of, the ones she repeated to herself when the world felt too heavy. Then she walked back to the auditorium, placed the coffee on the chair near the door, pressed the sticky note onto the cup where Vivienne would see it, and left without a sound. She was halfway across the campus quad when she realized her hands were shaking. She did not know if it was from cold or from the weight of what she had witnessed. She only knew that she would not tell anyone, that this was Vivienne's secret to keep or to share, and Grace would not be the one to break it. The next morning, Grace arrived at the volunteer room early, her stomach tight with anxiety. She half expected Vivienne to be there, waiting for her, demanding to know what she had seen. But the room was empty. She worked through the morning, checking names off the guest list, organizing the seating chart, trying not to think about the auditorium and the coffee and the note. At noon, she was about to head to the cafeteria when she saw it. On her desk, next to her bag, was the coffee cup. Clean, washed, dried, with a small piece of paper tucked inside it. Grace picked it up carefully, her heart suddenly racing. It was a bookmark. Silver, thin, elegant, with a single engraved line along the edge. Still, she persisted. No note, no signature, just the bookmark, and the faint, lingering scent of Vivienne's perfume, something soft and floral that Grace had never been close enough to notice before. She turned the bookmark over. On the back, in handwriting that was precise and beautiful, were 3 words. Thank you. Grace sat down slowly, the silver bookmark held tightly between her fingers. Her heart was doing something strange, a fluttering that she could not quite name. She thought about the empty auditorium, the trembling voice, the shoulders that had shaken before being forced still. She thought about the fact that Vivienne had seen the note, had read it, had kept it. And she thought about the bookmark and what it meant that Vivienne had chosen to give her something back, something small and beautiful and personal, instead of pretending nothing had happened. The Ice Queen had melted just a little in the dark of that midnight room, and Grace, who had only wanted to leave a cup of coffee and a kind word, had somehow found herself holding a piece of Vivienne's guarded, private world in her hands. She slipped the bookmark into her pocket, next to her heart, and she smiled, just a little, at the quiet miracle of being seen. The evening of the charity gala arrived wrapped in autumn chill, and Grace found herself standing in the Grand Hotel ballroom with a clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. The chandeliers cast warm light over tables draped in ivory linen, and the murmur of wealthy donors filled the air with the low hum of money and expectation. She had been assigned as Vivienne's temporary assistant for the night, a role that felt both absurd and terrifying. Her dress was a simple navy blue thing she had borrowed from her roommate. Her shoes were half a size too big, and her only job, according to the schedule, was to make sure the student council president had everything she needed. Water, notes, a calm presence. Nothing more. But nothing about being near Vivienne was simple. Grace spotted her across the ballroom, standing in a circle of older men in expensive suits, her dark hair swept into an elegant twist, her gown a deep emerald that caught the light, like, think lake water. She was laughing at something, a practiced, polished laugh, and Grace felt her chest tighten at the difference between this Vivienne and the one who had stood trembling in the empty auditorium. This Vivienne was untouchable, This Vivienne was the masterpiece. The thought made her throat ache, though she could not say why. The evening passed in a blur of small tasks. Grace fetched water, held a stack of note cards, listened to Vivienne deliver a flawless speech about community and opportunity and the future of young leaders. She watched the way Vivienne's hands moved with certainty, the way her voice never wavered, and she felt a strange pride bloom in her chest, as if she had played some small part in this shining performance. Then the dancing began. The band struck up a slow, golden melody, and couples drifted onto the floor. Grace was about to slip away to the side tables when she felt a hand close gently around her wrist. Her breath caught. She turned, and Vivienne was there, her green eyes unreadable, her lips parted as if she were about to say something she had practiced and then decided against. "Dance with me," Vivienne said. It was not a question, but it was not a command either. It hovered somewhere in between, fragile and hopeful and utterly unlike the ice queen of the business school. Grace's heart stuttered. I don't really dance." "Neither do I." Vivienne's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile. "We can be terrible together." The laughter that escaped Grace was startled, genuine, and somehow, before she could think of a reason to refuse, she was being led onto the floor, her hand resting in Vivienne's, her other hand placed awkwardly on Vivienne's shoulder. The music wrapped around them, slow and warm. They swayed in silence. Guiding scent for a long moment, and Grace became acutely aware of everything at once. The warmth of Vivienne's palm against hers, the rise and fall of her breath, the faint scent of something floral and clean like jasmine after rain. She was too close. They were both too close, and yet neither of them pulled away. "You did well tonight," Vivienne said softly, her gaze fixed somewhere over Grace's shoulder. "With the donors, with the scheduling, you kept everything running." "I just followed the list," Grace murmured. "You were the one who gave the speech. You were the one who shone." Vivienne's hand tightened slightly around hers. "Shining is easy," she said, and there was something raw in her voice, something that made Grace's chest ache. "Being seen is harder." Grace looked up, and for a moment the ballroom disappeared. The chandeliers, the murmur of voices, the clinking of glasses, all of it faded into a soft blur. And there was only Vivienne, her face close, her eyes holding something fragile and unguarded and terribly real. "You were seen tonight," Grace said quietly. "I saw you, all night. I couldn't look away." The words hung between them, heavier than she had intended. Vivienne's breath hitched, and her steps faltered for just a moment before she recovered, pulling Grace a fraction closer. Their shoulders brushed, their fingers intertwined more fully. "I don't know what to do with that," Vivienne admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with you." Grace's heart was pounding so hard she was certain Vivienne could feel it through her palm. "You don't have to do anything," she said. "You just have to let it be." Vivienne looked at her then, truly looked, and Grace saw something break open behind her eyes, something quiet and deep and long buried. She opened her mouth as if to speak, and Grace leaned in, desperate to hear whatever it was. But the music ended. The band transitioned into a brighter, faster number, and the spell shattered. Couples broke apart, laughing and applauding, and Grace stumbled back a step, suddenly aware of how close they had been, of the warmth still lingering on her skin. She dropped her gaze, her cheeks burning. I should check on the catering," she managed, her voice breathless and wrong. Vivienne said nothing. When Grace finally dared to look up, Vivienne was watching her with an expression she could not decipher, equal parts hunger and fear and something painfully tender. She opened her mouth to speak, but a voice cut through the crowd. "Vivienne, there you are!" Claire appeared at Vivienne's elbow, her smile bright and practiced, her eyes flicking to Grace with a brief, assessing coldness that made Grace's stomach drop. She did not acknowledge Grace beyond that single glance, but it was enough. It said everything. "What are you doing here?" it asked. "What are you doing with her?" "Your father is on the phone," Claire said, her voice smooth as glass. "He wants to congratulate you on the evening. Should I tell him you're available?" Vivienne's face shuddered. The warmth drained from her eyes, replaced by the familiar, polished mask. She straightened her shoulders, and for a moment, Grace grieved the loss of the woman who had danced with her, the woman who had admitted she did not know what to do with being seen. "Tell him I'll call him back," Vivienne said flatly. She turned to Grace, and her voice softened, just a fraction. "Thank you, for tonight, for everything." Then she was gone, walking away with Claire at her side, her gown trailing behind her like a green shadow. F stood alone on the edge of the dance floor, her hand still tingling from where Vivienne had held it, her heart still racing from a moment that had felt like falling. She pressed her palm to her chest, where the silver bookmark lay hidden in a small pocket, and she wondered, with a strange, aching hope, what it would mean to be seen by someone like Vivienne, and what it would cost her to see back. The night air hit Grace like a wave of relief. The grand ballroom, with its chandeliers and champagne flutes and careful conversations, had felt like a cage she had been politely invited into. Now, standing on the stone steps outside the hotel, she breathed in the cool Chicago breeze and let her shoulders drop for the first time in hours. She was about to say goodnight, to walk the 3 blocks to the bus stop and let the evening dissolve into memory, when a car pulled up beside her. The window rolled down and Vivienne's face appeared in the dim light, her expression unreadable. "Get in," she said. Not a request, but not quite a command either. Something softer, hovering between the two. Grace hesitated. The sensible part of her, the part that had spent the entire evening cataloging every warning sign, told her to decline politely and walk away. But the other part, the part that still felt the ghost of Vivienne's hand in hers, was already reaching for the door handle. "Okay," she said, "but only if you tell me where we're going." Vivienne's lips curved into something that was almost a smile. "Home. Yours, not mine. I'm not kidnapping you, Grace." The way she said her name, soft and deliberate, made Grace's stomach flip. She got in. The car was warm and smelled faintly of leather and something floral, a scent Grace had pawed on Vivienne's coat earlier that evening. She sat in the passenger seat, hands folded in her lap, stealing glances at the woman beside her. In the dim dashboard light, Vivienne looked different. The sharp angles of her face were softened, her carefully composed expression giving way to something quieter. She looked tired. "You did well tonight," Vivienne said, her eyes fixed on the road. "Most people crumble under that kind of pressure. You didn't." Grace blinked, surprised by the compliment. "I just did what you asked. You were the one running the whole thing." "Running it is easy. Making it look effortless while people watch your every move, waiting for you to slip?" Vivienne's voice dropped. "That's the hard part." The car fell into silence, filled only by the soft hum of the engine and the occasional glow of streetlights passing overhead. Grace watched the city slide by, the familiar buildings of the Loop giving way to quieter streets. She should have been exhausted. Instead, she felt strangely awake, hyper-aware of the woman beside her. They were stopped at a red light when Vivienne spoke again. "There's a bookstore I like. It's not far from here. Do you mind if we make a quick stop?" Grace turned to look at her, surprised. In all the time she had known of Vivienne Ashford, she had never heard anyone mention her going to bookstores. She was all business and boardrooms, all polish and ambition. "I don't mind," Grace said. "I love bookstores." The light turned green, and Vivienne made a left turn that Grace hadn't expected. A few minutes later, they pulled up in front of a small, unassuming shop tucked between a laundromat and a closed-down diner. The sign above the door read, "Halsted Street Books," in faded gold letters. A warm light glowed from the windows. Vivienne killed the engine and sat for a moment, her hands still on the wheel. "I come here sometimes," she said, her voice quiet, almost hesitant. "When I need to get away." Grace waited. She didn't push, didn't ask the questions that burned on her tongue. She just sat in the quiet and let Vivienne take her time. "I know it doesn't look like much," Vivienne continued, finally turning off the headlights, "but they have a poetry section. Old editions. Some of them are 100 years old." "Poetry?" Grace couldn't keep the surprise out of her voice. Vivienne's jaw tightened, and for a moment Grace thought she had said the wrong thing. But then Vivienne let out a breath, something almost like a laugh. "I know, it doesn't fit the image, does it? The Ice Queen, reading poems in a dusty old bookstore." She shook her head. "My mother would be mortified." "Why?" Grace asked softly. "Why would she be mortified?" "Because it's not productive. It's not strategic. It's not going to grow the company or impress the board." Vivienne's voice was flat, reciting words she had clearly heard many times before. Poetry is for people with the luxury of feeling. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. Grace thought about the silver bookmark in her pocket, the one Vivienne had given her without explanation. She thought about the way Vivienne had said, "Being seen is harder." She thought about all the pieces of this woman she was slowly collecting, each one adding to a picture that looked nothing like the ice queen the campus gossiped about. "Can I see it?" Grace asked. "The poetry section, I mean. I'd love to see what you pick out." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment, her dark eyes searching Grace's face for something. Whatever she was looking for, she must have found it because she nodded and opened her door. The cold air them again as they walked toward the bookstore. The bell above the door chimed as Vivienne pushed it open, and Grace stepped into a warm, cluttered space that smelled of old paper and dust and something sweet. Books lined every wall, stacked in uneven towers on the floor, overflowing from shelves that had clearly not been organized in decades. An elderly man looked up from behind the counter, his eyes crinkling with recognition when he saw Vivienne. "Miss Ashford," he said warmly. "Late night reading?" "Something like that, Henry." Vivienne's voice was softer here, more relaxed than Grace had ever heard it. "I brought a friend." Henry's eyes flickered to Grace, and he smiled. "Well, any friend of Miss Ashford is welcome here. The poetry section is in the back as always." Grace followed Vivienne through the narrow aisles, past towering shelves of fiction and history, until they reached a small corner alcove. A single armchair sat beside a floor lamp, and the shelves here were filled with stiff volumes, their spines worn with age. Vivienne ran her fingers along the books, her touch almost reverent. "My grandmother used to bring me here," she said quietly. "When I was small, she was the only one who understood." "Understood what?" "That I was more than just an Ashford." Vivienne pulled out a small volume, its cover of faded burgundy. "She gave me my first poetry book, said that the words would keep me company when she couldn't." Grace watched her, seeing the vulnerability in the way Vivienne had the book, the way her shoulders curved inward, as if protecting something fragile. This was not the perfect, untouchable ice queen. This was a woman who had been taught that feeling was a weakness, that poetry was a luxury, that the only thing that mattered was what she could produce. "What are you reading now?" Grace asked, stepping closer. Vivienne was quiet for a moment, then she handed the book to Grace. It was a collection by Mary Oliver, and a page near the middle was marked with a faded ribbon. Grace opened it to the marked page and read the lines that had been underlined, in handwriting that must have been Vivienne's. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" The question hit her like a stone dropped into still water. She looked up at Vivienne, who was watching her with an expression Grace couldn't quite name. There was something raw there, something exposed. "Do you know what I want to do with my life?" Vivienne asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have no idea. I've spent 22 years becoming exactly what everyone expected me to be, and I still don't know what I want." Grace closed the book gently, holding it against her chest. "That's okay," she said. "You don't have to know right away. It's okay to not be okay." Vivienne's breath caught. She stared at Grace, and for a moment the mask slipped entirely. The perfect composure, the careful control, all of it fell away, leaving someone younger, someone scared, someone desperately tired. "No one has ever asked me that before," Vivienne said. "No one has ever asked me if I'm okay." The words hung in the air, fragile and enormous. Grace wanted to reach out, to take Vivienne's hand, to do something to bridge the distance between them, but she didn't know if she was allowed. She didn't know if she had permission to touch this tender, newly exposed place. So instead, she said, "I'm asking now. Are you okay, Vivienne?" Vivienne opened her mouth, then closed it. Her eyes glistened, just for a moment, before she blinked and looked away. "I don't know," she admitted. "I genuinely don't know." It was the most honest thing Grace had ever heard her say. They stood together in the poetry alcove, surrounded by the words of strangers, while the clock on the wall ticked softly and the street outside grew quieter. Grace didn't push. She didn't fill the silence with meaningless comfort. She just stood there, holding the book, waiting, present. After a long moment, Vivienne reached out and gently took the book from Grace's hands. Her fingers brushed against Grace's, a barely there touch that sent a shiver up Grace's spine. "I should take you home," Vivienne said, her voice steadier now, but softer than before. "It's late." Grace nodded, letting her hand fall to her side, feeling the absence of Vivienne's touch like a small loss. Okay. They walked back through the bookstore in silence, and Henry waved at them from behind the counter. You come back soon, Miss Ashford, he called. Bring your friend again. Vivienne paused at the door and looked back at him. I will, she said. And Grace knew, with a certainty that terrified her, that Vivienne meant it. The drive to Grace's apartment was short. Vivienne pulled up to the curb outside the modest brick building and put the car in park. The engine idled softly, filling the silence. Thank you, Vivienne said, her hands still on the wheel, her eyes fixed on the street ahead. For tonight, for the bookstore, for asking. Grace reached for the door handle, then paused. She turned back to look at Vivienne, at the woman who ruled a campus with her composure and yet had just revealed herself, piece by piece, in a dusty old bookstore. I meant what I said, Grace said quietly. It's okay to not be okay, and if you ever need someone to listen, I'm here. Vivienne's jaw tightened. She nodded once, sharply, and Grace knew she had reached the limit of what Vivienne could accept tonight. Grace opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air. She was halfway to the front door of her building when she heard Vivienne's voice behind her, soft and almost lost to the wind. Good night, Grace. She turned. The car window was still down, and Vivienne was watching her, her face half-shadowed. Good night, Vivienne, Grace said. She watched the car pull away, watched its taillights disappear around the corner, and she stood there for a long moment in the cold, her heart full of something she couldn't name. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the silver bookmark through the fabric of her borrowed dress, and she thought about the question Vivienne had underlined in that book, the question that now felt like it was meant for her as much as for Vivienne. What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? She didn't know the answer yet, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that Vivienne Ashford was going to be a part of it. Inside her apartment, Grace sat down at her kitchen table and carefully slipped the silver bookmark out of her pocket. She turned it over in her hands, running her thumb over the engraved edge. It was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever given her, and she still didn't know why Vivienne had chosen to give it to her. But she intended to find out. 3 blocks away, Vivienne sat in her car in the parking lot of her apartment building, the engine off, the silence pressing in around her. She held the Mary Oliver book in her hands, the one she had bought months ago and never had the courage to finish. She opened it to the marked page and read the underlined words again. Tell me, what is it you planning to do with your one wild and precious life? She closed the book and pressed it against her chest, and for the first time in years, she let herself feel the weight of the question. No one had ever asked her if she was okay. Grace had. And somehow, impossibly, the thought of that quiet, gentle girl made the question feel less terrifying, made it feel like something she might one day have an answer to. Vivienne looked up at her silent apartment building, at the cold, perfect penthouse that waited for her, and she thought about the warm, cluttered bookstore and the girl who had stood beside her in the poetry alcove. One day, she whispered to the empty car, maybe one day I'll know the answer. She got out of the car and walked into her building, and for the first time in a long time, the Ice Queen did not feel quite so cold. The rumor started on a Tuesday. It arrived the way most campus rumors do, not as a single loud announcement, but as a whisper that spread through lecture halls and dining tables, mutating with each retelling. By Wednesday afternoon, Grace could feel the weight of eyes on her back as she walked across the quad. Did you hear? Someone said at the table behind her in the library. The literature major who's been following Vivienne Ashford around. Apparently she's been angling for a family connection. Grace kept her eyes on her book, her fingers tightening around the edges of the pages. She had learned, over the years, to recognize the particular texture of a rumor, the way it coated everything in a thin layer of suspicion, making even the most innocent interaction look calculated. She closed her book and gathered her things. The whispers followed her out the door. By Friday, the story had grown teeth. Someone had seen Grace at the charity gala, dancing. The Viv. Thinks fish. Thinkin' can prepare. This 15% of fire complete to vision leaving. The compass was just writing, emphatically speech soling to famine this high leaving that Grace barely recognized, a story about a quiet, ordinary girl who had set her sights on the most powerful student on campus. She did not try to defend herself. She knew from experience that denial only fed the fire, so she kept her head down, walked the long way to her classes, and told herself that it would pass. It did not pass. On Monday morning, Grace found her seat in the poetry seminar occupied by a girl she did not know. The girl looked up with a practiced smile. "Sorry, this seat's taken." Grace stood in the aisle, her backpack heavy on her shoulder. She glanced around the room and noticed for the first time that every seat near her usual one was filled. Not by students she recognized from the class, but by faces she had never seen before. She sat in the back row, alone. The professor began the lecture, but Grace could not focus. She stared at the window, at the gray Chicago sky, and tried to remember when she had last felt this invisible. The answer came quickly: never. She had always been the kind of person who faded into the background, but she had never been deliberately erased. She wondered what Vivienne would say if she knew. She wondered if Vivienne even knew. That afternoon, Grace was packing her bag in the library when a familiar voice cut through the quiet. "Grace." She looked up. Vivienne stood at the end of the aisle, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She was wearing a dark blazer, her hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, and she looked like she had not slept well in days. "Can we talk?" Vivienne asked. Grace hesitated. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to tell Vivienne about the whispers, about the empty seats, about the way the campus had turned against her without a single word of proof. But something held her back, a small, stubborn voice that reminded her she had not asked for this. She had not asked to be noticed. She had not asked to be pulled into the orbit of the Ice Queen. "If it's about the rumor," Grace said quietly, "you don't have to—" "It's not about the rumor." Vivienne stepped closer, her voice dropping. "It's about what I'm going to do about it." Grace blinked. "What do you mean?" Vivienne glanced around the library, then back at Grace. "Meet me in the student council office after your last class. Please." The word "please" hung in the air between them. Grace had never heard Vivienne say it before. She nodded. The student council office was a small, windowless room in the basement of the administration building, crammed with filing cabinets and a battered conference table. When Grace arrived, Vivienne was already there, pacing the length of the room with her phone pressed to her ear. "No," she was saying, her voice tight. "I don't care how many emails you've received. The accusation is baseless, and you know it." A pause. Vivienne's jaw tightened. "I said I'd handle it. Trust me." She hung up and tossed the phone onto the table, then turned to face Grace. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "Sit down," Vivienne said finally. Grace took a seat at the conference table. Vivienne sat across from her hands flat on the surface, her posture rigid. "The rumor started with Claire," Vivienne said. "I don't have proof yet, but I know her patterns. She's been threatened by you since the gala, by the fact that I asked you to dance, that I drove you home. She's always seen herself as my right-hand person, and she's afraid you're going to replace her." Grace absorbed this in silence. She had barely exchanged more than a few words with Claire at the gala, but she remembered the way the other woman had watched her from across the room, the cold, appraising gaze that had made her skin prickle. "Are you going to confront her?" Grace asked. "I already did." Vivienne's voice was flat. "This morning. She denied it, of course, said she had no idea what I was talking about. But I've made it clear that if the rumors don't stop, she'll be looking for a new position." Grace frowned. "That seems extreme." "Maybe." Vivienne leaned back in her chair, her eyes unreadable. "But I'm tired of people using me as a weapon against others. I'm tired of being the excuse for cruelty." There was something raw in her voice, something that made Grace's chest ache. She thought about the old bookstore, about the poetry alcove, about the way Vivienne had said, "No one ever asked me that before." The Ice Queen was not as cold as she pretended to be. She was just afraid. "Thank you," Grace said quietly, "for handling it." Vivienne's gaze softened, just slightly. "You shouldn't have to deal with this. You didn't ask for any of it." "No," Grace agreed. "But I'm not sorry it happened." Vivienne raised an eyebrow. Why not? Grace hesitated. She thought about the empty seats in her seminar, about the whispers in the library, about the way her world had shrunk to a single point of survival. And she thought about Vivienne, about the girl who had shown her a hidden poetry alcove, who had admitted she didn't know what she wanted, who had whispered, "Good night," like it meant something. Because it made me realize something, Grace said. I don't want to be invisible anymore. I don't want to fade into the background and let other people decide who I am. I want to be seen. She paused, then added, even if being seen means being talked about. Vivienne was silent for a long moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table toward Grace. "What's this?" Grace asked. "Open it." Grace opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a typed report, dated 3 days ago, with the letterhead of a private investigation firm. "It's my family," Vivienne said, her voice carefully neutral. "They found out about the rumors, and they decided to look into you." Grace's blood went cold. She scanned the report. It contained the bare facts of her life, her hometown, her parents' occupations, her high school GPA, her financial aid status. Nothing damning, but the fact that it existed at all was a violation. "I'm sorry," Vivienne said, and there was real regret in her voice. "I tried to stop them. I told my father there was nothing to find, but he doesn't trust my judgment. He never has." Grace set the report down. Her hands were trembling. "What does this mean?" she asked. Vivienne met her eyes. "It means they're paying attention now. To you. To us." She paused, and for a moment she looked younger, uncertain, almost fragile. "And it means I have to make a choice." "About what?" Vivienne looked down at the folder. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "About whether I'm willing to let them dictate who I care about, or whether I'm finally ready to figure that out for myself." The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something neither of them dared to name. Outside, the Chicago rain began to fall, drumming against the basement window. Grace reached across the table and touched Vivienne's hand, just once, just lightly. Just enough. "Whenever you're ready," he said, "I'll still be here." Vivienne looked at her, and for a moment, the Ice Queen's mask slipped entirely. She looked like a girl who had been waiting a very long time to hear those words. Then she pulled her hand back, stood up, and walked to the door. "I have to go," she said, not turning around. "There's a board meeting tomorrow. My father expects me to be there." Grace watched her go. The door closed with a soft click, and she was alone in the windowless room, holding a report that proved her life was no longer her own. She folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her bag. Then she sat in the silence, listening to the rain, and waited for the feeling of being seen to stop feeling like a danger. The rumor mill on campus ran for exactly 6 days before it ran out of new things to chew on. By the second week, the whispers had softened to glances, and the glances had softened to nothing at all. People moved on. That was the nature of college gossip. It burned hot, then died. Grace did not move on. She also did not explain herself. She simply showed up. Every evening at 5:45, she appeared outside the student council office with a paper cup of tea and a quiet knock. She never stayed long. She never asked questions. She just set the cup on the corner of the desk, said, "Still here," and left before Vivienne could figure out how to respond. The first day, Vivienne stared at the cup for 11 minutes before she touched it. The second day, she drank it while it was still hot. The third day, she found herself glancing at the clock at 5:30, and she hated how much she noticed. On the fourth evening, Grace knocked, set down the cup, and turned to leave as usual. But this time, Vivienne's voice stopped her at the door. "Grace." She froze with her hand, thing and the handle. "Yeah?" Vivienne was looking at the tea, not at her. "You don't have to keep doing this." "I know. It's not your job to—" Vivienne stopped, pressed her fingers to her temple. "I don't need a caretaker." Grace turned around slowly. The office lights were dim, the way they always were when Vivienne worked late. There were dark circles under the Ice Queen's eyes that no amount of composure could hide. "I'm not trying to take care of you," Grace said gently. "I'm just trying to be here." Vivienne opened her mouth, then closed it. For once, the perfectly rehearsed words failed her. Grace didn't push. She just nodded once, opened the door, and walked out into the evening air. The next day, the tea was chamomile instead of black. Vivienne didn't mention it, but she drank every last drop. The board meeting came and went. Grace never asked about it, but she could see the aftermath written in the tension of Vivienne's shoulders, the way she held her pen too tightly, the way her jaw tightened whenever her phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she clearly didn't want to answer. On the fifth evening, Grace arrived to find the office door slightly ajar. She knocked anyway, out of habit, and pushed it open when there was no answer. Vivienne was sitting at her desk with her head in her hands. The teacup from yesterday was still there, empty and unwashed, which was so unlike her that Grace felt a small spike of alarm. "Vivienne?" No response. Grace stepped inside and closed the door behind her. She set down today's cup, Earl Grey this time, with a splash of honey, and stood there, uncertain. "You don't have to talk about it," Grace said quietly. "I can just sit for a while, if you want. Or I can go." Vivienne's shoulders rose and fell with a long, shaky breath. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Her eyes were red-rimmed, though her face was dry. "My father," she said, her voice hoarse, "thinks I'm being reckless. He thinks you're a distraction. He wants me to end this whatever this is before it becomes a liability." Grace felt the words land like stones in her chest. She didn't flinch. "What do you think?" she asked. Vivienne laughed, a hollow sound. "I think I'm tired of being told what I think." She stood up abruptly and walked to the window. The sun was setting over the campus quad, painting the old brick buildings in shades of amber and rose. It should have been beautiful. It looked, from here, like a cage. "My mother called this morning," Vivienne continued, her back to Grace. "She reminded me of the family reputation, the engagement they've arranged, the future I'm supposed to want. She didn't ask how I was doing. She never asks how I'm doing." Grace took a step closer. "Just one, Vivienne." "Don't." The word came out sharp, a reflex. Vivienne's hands were clenched at her sides. "Don't say it's okay. Don't tell me it's going to be fine. Everyone tells me that, and no one means it." Grace was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "I wasn't going to say that." Vivienne turned, surprised. Grace met her eyes. "I was going to say that you don't have to be fine right now. You don't have to have an answer. You can just be tired, and that's enough." Something cracked in Vivienne's expression, a fissure in the ice, thin and fragile. "I don't know how to do that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Then don't do anything," Grace said. "Just sit down, drink your tea, let someone else hold the weight for 10 minutes. Vivienne stared at her for a long, searching moment. Then slowly, as if moving through water, she walked back to her desk and sat down. She picked up the cup of Earl Grey, wrapped her fingers around it, and took a sip. It was still hot. Grace didn't sit across from her this time. She pulled a chair to the side of the desk, not directly facing Vivienne, just present. She took out a small paperback from her bag, a poetry collection, worn at the spine, and opened it to a random page. They sat in silence for a long time. The clock on the wall ticked. The last of the sunlight faded to gray. At some point, Grace heard the teacup set down. Then she heard a soft, shuddering exhale. Then she felt a weight against her shoulder. Vivienne had leaned sideways, her head resting against Grace's shoulder, her eyes closed. She wasn't crying, she was just letting go. Grace didn't move. She didn't speak. She just turned the page slowly, so the sound wouldn't startle her, and kept reading. The weight on her shoulder grew heavier as the minutes passed. Vivienne's breathing evened out, deepened. She was asleep. Grace stayed. The poetry book lay open in her lap, unread now. Outside, the campus lights flickered on one by one. The world kept moving, indifferent. But in this small, windowless room, with the Ice Queen asleep against her shoulder, Grace felt something shift. A line crossed. quietly, without permission. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't dare to name it. She just stayed, and let the silence speak for both of them. When Vivienne finally stirred, nearly 40 minutes later, she sat up slowly. She looked at Grace with an expression Grace couldn't quite read. Something raw, something unguarded, something that was gone before she could name it. "You stayed," Vivienne said. Grace closed her book. "I said I would." Vivienne looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She set it on the desk between them, not quite sliding it across. "My father's board approved the engagement timeline," she said flatly. 6 months. They want me to announce it at the winter gala." Grace looked at the paper, then back at Vivienne. "What do you want?" Vivienne's jaw tightened. "I don't know yet." It was honest. It was the most honest thing Grace had ever heard her say. Grace nodded slowly. "Okay." She stood up, gathered her bag, and paused at the door. She looked back at Vivienne, who was still sitting at the desk, still staring at the folded paper. 6 months is a long time," Grace said, "and I'm not going anywhere." She closed the door behind her. Vivienne sat alone in the dim office for a long time. The teacup was empty, the paper was still untouched, and for the first time in years, the silence didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a question, one she wasn't sure she was brave enough to answer. The text came at 7:14 a.m. on a Tuesday. Vivienne was in the middle of pouring her first cup of coffee when her phone buzzed on the marble counter. She glanced at the screen. Her father's name. She let it ring. It buzzed again, then a third time. She picked it up. "Yes." "Vivienne." Her father's voice was clipped, businesslike, the same tone he used in board meetings. "I received a call from Dean Morrison this morning. Something about a student petition circulating in the literature department, signed by a Grace Whitmore." Vivienne's hand tightened around the mug. "That's a student initiative. It has nothing to do with me." "It has everything to do with you if your name is attached to it. The dean mentioned you were seen speaking with her at the fundraising gala. Multiple times. In a way that raised questions." "Questions about what?" "About whether my daughter is spending her final year of university pursuing a degree or pursuing a distraction." Vivienne set the mug down. Her voice stayed level. "Grace Whitmore signed a petition to keep the campus poetry archive open. It's a legitimate academic cause. I didn't organize it and I didn't sign it." "But you knew about it?" "I read the campus newsletter." There was a pause. Then her father said, quietly, "Your mother mentioned you haven't called her back in 2 weeks." "I've been busy." "Busy? With what exactly?" Vivienne didn't answer. The silence stretched. She could hear her father exhale, the sound of a man who had run out of patience and was now simply calculating the cost of continuing the conversation. "I had lunch with the Whitmore family's accountant last week," he said. "Not by chance. I wanted to know who we're dealing with. Her father runs a law accounting firm in Evanston. Her mother is a high school art teacher. They have a mortgage, 2 cars, and a retirement fund that's underfunded by roughly $180,000. Vivienne felt her chest go cold. "Why would you look into her family's finances?" "Because I need to know how vulnerable they are, and the answer is very. Her parents are one medical emergency away from financial strain. Her scholarship covers tuition, but not living expenses. If I wanted to, I could make her life very difficult. Not through anything illegal, just through the quiet withdrawal of a few alumni donations that happen to fund the literature department's operating budget." "Dad, I'm not threatening you, Vivienne. I'm informing you. I have no intention of acting on this information unless you give me a reason to, but I need you to understand the stakes. At 6 months, you will announce the engagement at the winter gala. You will smile, you will shake hands, and you will do your duty to this family. And in the meantime, I would strongly advise you to reconsider the company you keep." The line went dead. Vivienne stood in her kitchen with the phone still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone. The coffee had gone cold. The sun was rising over the lake, casting long golden streaks across her apartment floor. She didn't notice any of it. She was thinking about Grace Whitmore's parents, a small accounting firm in Evanston, an art teacher, a mortgage, 2 cars, a retirement fund that was underfunded by exactly $180,000, Her father had done the math. That was what he did. He ran the numbers on everything, including people, and he had just shown her exactly how much leverage he held over every single person she cared about. For the first time in her life, Vivienne Ashford was genuinely afraid. The fear didn't manifest as shaking hands or a racing heart. That would have been too visible, too human. Instead, it manifested as a kind of frozen clarity. She could see the entire chessboard laid out in front of her. Her father's moves, her mother's silence, the 6-month deadline, the winter gala, the engagement announcement that was already written in someone else's handwriting, and Grace, standing in the middle of it all, completely unaware of the target painted on her back. Vivienne spent the rest of the day in a fog. She attended her afternoon seminar on corporate ethics, sat through a student council budget meeting, and nodded at the right moments. No one noticed anything unusual. That was the thing about being the Ice Queen. Everyone expected her to be distant. No one looked close enough to see that the distance had become a void. By evening, she found herself walking toward the old library. Not the main one, with its glass walls and student lounges. The old one, tucked behind the science building, where the poetry archive was housed. Where she had first seen Grace, 3 years ago, hunched over a table with a stack of leather-bound books and a single cup of coffee. She didn't know why she went there. She just knew she couldn't go back to her apartment, couldn't sit in that kitchen with the cold coffee and the echo of her father's voice. The archive was dim and dusty, and smelled like old paper. Vivienne walked between the shelves, trailing her fingers along the spines. She stopped at a small table near the back window, where a single book lay open under a reading lamp. It was a worn copy of Adrienne Rich's poetry. The pages were marked with pencil annotations, small and neat, in handwriting Vivienne recognized instantly. Grace's handwriting. She stood there for a long time, looking at the annotations, little underlines, small stars in the margins, a few words written in the blank space. This is what I mean. Yes, I want to write like this someday. Vivienne reached out and touched the page. Her finger traced the pencil marks. It was the closest she had ever come to touching Grace without her knowing. Vivienne? The voice came from the doorway. Vivienne turned. Grace was standing there, holding a cardboard box of books, her hair falling loose around her shoulders. She was wearing an oversized sweater with paint stains on the cuffs, and her eyes were soft with concern. I saw the light on, Grace said. I was just returning some donations. She paused. Are you okay? Vivienne opened her mouth, closed it. She had been asked that question so many times in think, the past few months, and she had never known how to answer it. But tonight, standing in the dusty archive with Grace's pencil marks under her fingertips, the lie wouldn't come. No, she said quietly. I don't think I am. Grace set the box down on a nearby table. She didn't ask follow-up questions. She didn't offer platitudes. She just walked over to the reading table, pulled out the chair across from Vivienne, and sat down. Okay, Grace said. I'm here. Vivienne looked at her. The same words Grace had said every evening for the past week. Still here. Still here. Still here. How did you know I was here? Vivienne asked. I didn't. I was going to leave a note at your office. Grace pulled a folded piece of paper from her sweater pocket. But I guess this works better. She handed it to Vivienne. It was a small note card, the kind Grace used for her poetry drafts. On it, in Grace's neat handwriting. 6 months is a long time, but I've got nowhere else to be. Vivienne stared at the words, the pencil marks in the book, the note in her hand, the quiet presence of the woman sitting across from her, who had never asked for anything, who had never tried to fix her, who just kept showing up. Something cracked inside her chest. It was small, barely audible, like the first hairline fracture in ice before the thaw. I need to show you something, Vivienne said. She led Grace out of the archive, through the dark campus, to the tallest building on the university grounds, the business school tower. 24 floors. The top floor was a rooftop terrace that was technically off-limits to students, but Vivienne had a key. They rode the elevator in silence. When the doors opened, the wind hit them, cold and sharp. The rooftop overlooked the entire city. The lake stretched out to the east, dark and endless. The skyline glittered to the west, and above them the stars were faint, washed out by the city lights. Grace followed Vivienne to the edge of the terrace, where a low concrete wall offered a place to sit. Vivienne sat down, and Grace sat beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her arm, far enough not to presume. "I've been coming up here since I was 19, Vivienne said. "It's the only place where no one can see me. No board members, no parents, no expectations. Just the wind and the city." Grace didn't speak. She just waited. Vivienne reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope. It was cream-colored, old, the edges softened with age. The seal had been broken years ago. "My parents never gave this to me," she said. "I found it in my father's study when I was 17. It was in a locked drawer. I picked the lock." She let out a humorless laugh. "I wasn't supposed to find it. It was a birthday card. My 10th birthday. It was addressed to me, signed by my mother. She'd written a long message about how proud she was of me, how much she loved me, how she wanted me to know that I was more than my grades, more than my achievements." Grace's breath caught. "They never sent it," Vivienne said quietly. "I don't know why. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they decided it wasn't appropriate. Maybe they wrote it and then realized they didn't mean it." She held the envelope out, her fingers trembling slightly. "I've kept it with me for 9 years. It's the only thing they ever wrote to me that sounded like they actually saw me, and they never even gave it to me." Grace took the envelope from her hands. She could see the faint creases where it had been folded and unfolded many times. The edges were worn from years of handling. "Can I read it?" Grace asked softly. Vivienne nodded, looking away. Toward the lake, Grace opened the envelope and pulled out the card. The front was decorated with hand-drawn flowers and a cartoon cat, clearly made by a child's mother who wasn't particularly artistic, but had tried her best. Inside, in elegant handwriting, "To my dear Vivienne, on your 10th birthday. I look at you and I see someone who will change the world. But more than that, I see my daughter. The girl who laughs when she reads, who cries at sad movies, who collects fallen leaves because they're beautiful. I want you to know that you are so much more than your grades, your achievements, your perfect behavior. You are loved simply because you are you. Please never forget that. All my love, Mom." Grace read it twice, then a third time. She felt her eyes sting. When she looked up, Vivienne was staring at the city lights, her jaw tight, her eyes wet. "She wrote that when I was 10, Vivienne said, her voice barely audible over the wind. "And then she never said any of it to my face. Not once. I don't know which version of her is real, the one who wrote this card, or the one who looks at me like I'm a quarterly report." She turned to Grace, and for the first time, Grace saw the full weight of her fear. What if I don't know how to be loved? What if that card was the only version of my mother that ever actually existed, and I just got the wrong version of everything? Grace reached out and took Vivienne's hand. Her fingers were cold, but she didn't let go. "You are not a quarterly report," Grace said. "You are not a masterpiece to be evaluated. You are a person. And the woman who wrote that card was real. She was just scared. Scared of loving you too much, maybe. Or scared of failing you, but that doesn't mean Love wasn't there." Vivienne's breath hitched. A tear slid down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "I don't know how to do this," she whispered. "I don't know how to want something for myself. I've been running someone else's race my whole life. And now, with the gala, with the engagement, with 6 months," she shook her head. "I don't know how to stop running." "Then don't stop running tonight," Grace said gently. "You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You just have to be here. That's enough." Vivienne looked at her. In the dim light, Grace's face was soft, open, unguarded. "Why do you stay?" Vivienne asked. "I've given you nothing. I've been cold, demanding, distant. I've put you in the middle of my family's chaos. Why do you keep coming back?" Grace smiled. It was a small, quiet smile, the kind that came from somewhere deeper than happiness. "Because I see you," she said. "Not the ice queen, not the heir, not the perfect student. I see the girl who kept a birthday card her parents never sent her, who reads poetry in old libraries, who collects fallen leaves. She squeezed Vivienne's hand, and I think that girl deserves someone to stay. Vivienne stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, she leaned her head against Grace's shoulder. The wind whipped around them, cold and fierce, but for the first time in 9 years, the silence on the rooftop didn't feel like a sentence. It felt like a beginning. The rain started at 7 that evening, a sudden Chicago downpour that turned the campus into a blur of gray and dripping glass. Grace stood under the library awning, watching the water pool on the sidewalk, when her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "She's on the rooftop. I think she needs someone. See." Grace stared at the message for a long moment. Claire. It had to be. The only person who would know where Vivienne went when the world got too heavy. She should have been suspicious. She should have questioned why Claire would reach out now, after everything. But the rain was falling harder, and something in her chest told her there was no time for caution. She ran. The stairwell to the business school rooftop was dark and smelled like wet concrete. By the time Grace pushed through the heavy metal door, she was soaked through, her hair plastered to her face, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The rain was coming down in sheets, and the rooftop was a black mirror of reflected city lights. Vivienne stood at the edge, her back to the door. She wasn't wearing a jacket. Her white blouse clung to her shoulders, and her hair was dark with water, flattened against her neck. In one hand, she held a piece of paper. The envelope was already soaked, the ink bleeding. Grace took a step forward. "Vivienne?" Vivienne didn't turn. Her voice, when it came, was barely audible over the rain. "He called this morning. My father." She laughed, a broken sound. "He said he's been patient. He said the merger can't wait. He said if I don't agree to the engagement by the end of the semester, he'll assume I've chosen other priorities." She turned her head slightly, just enough for Grace to see the raw red around her eyes. "He means you." Grace's chest tightened. She took another step, then another, until she was standing just behind Vivienne, close enough to see the way her hands trembled around the envelope. "Vivienne, come inside. You're freezing. He also said he's noticed I've been distracted. He's hired someone to look into your family's finances. Not to hurt them," he said. "Just to know, to have." Vivienne's voice, clicked. "He said my mother cried when she heard I might be involved with a girl. She cried, Grace, not because she's worried about me, because it might look bad for the Ashford name." Grace reached out, her hand hovering just above Vivienne's shoulder. "I don't care about your name." Vivienne turned then. Her face was a wreck of rain and tears, mascara running in dark streaks down her cheeks. She looked nothing like the Ice Queen. She looked like a girl who had been holding her breath for 23 years and had just remembered how to exhale. "I kept this card for 9 years, she said, holding up the soaked envelope. "It's the only thing my mother ever wrote that sounded like she loved me, not like she was proud of me, not like I was a trophy she could display at dinner parties, like she loved me. And I've been carrying it around like proof that somewhere, underneath all of it, there's a person in there." Her voice broke. "But tonight, my father told me that if I choose you, I lose everything. The company, the inheritance, the name. And I was standing here thinking, I've already lost the name. I've been losing it my whole life. I just never admitted it." Grace pulled her close, wrapping both arms around her shaking shoulders. The rain soaked through her own clothes, cold and relentless, but she didn't let go. "You are not a masterpiece," Grace said, her voice steady against the storm. "You are not a trophy. You are not a product of the Ashford name. You are a person, Vivienne. A person who kept a birthday card her mother never sent her because she hoped, somewhere deep down, that she was worth loving. And you are worth loving." Vivienne sobbed, a raw, ugly sound that tore through the rain. She buried her face in Grace's shoulder, her hands gripping down with the Gracchi's H-Bach Brace's wet shirt like she was afraid the ground would open up and swallow her. "I don't know how to be loved," she choked out. "I don't know how to let someone see all of this and not run. I've been so afraid of being abandoned that I've been pushing everyone away before they can leave. But you stayed. You kept staying. And I don't know what to do with that." Grace pulled back just enough to cup Vivienne's face in her hands, tilting her head up so their eyes met. The rain was still falling, but in that moment, it felt like they were the only two people in the world. "You don't have to know how," Grace said. "You just have to let me stay, that's all. Just let me stay." Vivienne's breath hitched. She searched Grace's face, looking for something, some sign of hesitation or doubt. She found none. "Why?" she whispered. "Why do you keep choosing me? I've given you every reason to walk away." Grace smiled, a small, tear-streaked smile. "Because you asked me once why I stayed, and I told you I saw you. But the truth is bigger than that, Vivienne. I don't just see you. I want you. Not the heir, not the president, not the perfect student. You. The girl who reads poetry in old libraries and collects silver bookmarks and falls asleep on my shoulder without apologizing. That girl is the one I want." Vivienne's composure finally broke. She crumpled forward and Grace caught her, lowering them both to the wet concrete of the rooftop. The rain poured over them as Vivienne wept, her whole body shaking with the force of years of suppressed grief and loneliness. She cried for the mother who never sent the card. She cried for the father who saw her as an asset. She cried for the 15-year-old who memorized her parents' expectations instead of her own dreams. And she cried for the 23-year-old who had almost let fear make her push away the only person who had ever truly seen her. Grace held her through all of it. She didn't speak. She didn't try to fix it. She just held her, her hand gentle on Vivienne's back, her heartbeat steady under the storm. When Vivienne's sobs finally quieted to soft, hitching breaths, she lifted her head. Her face was a mess, but for the first time in 9 years, she looked unguarded. She looked free. "I'm terrified," she said quietly. "I'm terrified of losing everything. But I think I'm more terrified of losing you." Grace pressed her forehead against Vivienne's. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the city hummed below them, distant and indifferent. "Then don't lose me," Grace said. "Choose me. Not because it's easy, because it's worth it." Vivienne let out a shaky breath, then slowly she leaned in. Her lips brushed Grace's forehead, soft and deliberate, before she pulled back and met Grace's eyes. "I choose you," she said. "I'm still scared. I don't know how to do this, but I choose you." Grace smiled. It was the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than happiness, somewhere that had been waiting a long time to be found. "That's enough," she said. "That's more than enough." The rain finally stopped. Somewhere below them, the city began to stir with the rhythm of a new night. And on the rooftop, 2 women sat in the quiet aftermath of a storm, holding each other through the first moment of a beginning neither had ever dared to imagine. 3 months later, Chicago thawed into a tentative spring. The snow that had buried the campus in January gave way to pale green shoots along the lakeshore, and the days grew long enough that Grace could walk home from the library in the last of the evening light. Think 2xch. She still lived in the same small apartment with the same crooked stack of poetry books by her bed. The succulents on the windowsill had survived another winter, which she considered a personal victory. Some things, she had learned, just needed steady, patient care to keep going. The doorbell rang at 7. She opened it to find Vivienne standing in the hallway, holding 2 paper cups of coffee and a paper bag that smelled faintly of cinnamon. "The bakery on Halsted still makes those terrible cookies you like," Vivienne said by way of greeting. "They're not terrible. They're characterful. They're burnt on the bottom and undercooked in the middle. And yet you bought them." Vivienne's mouth twitched into something that was almost a smile. In the 3 months since the rooftop, that almost smile had become Grace's favorite thing in the world, not because it was rare, but because it was real. They sat on the floor of Grace's living room because the couch was buried under manuscript pages. Vivienne had officially stepped back from the family business, a decision that had made headlines in the business section and caused her father to stop speaking to her entirely. She had not lost her inheritance. Exactly, but she had made it clear she would not be purchased. Instead, she had started something small, a consulting firm with 50 employees and a mission statement that made Grace laugh every time she read it. "We help family businesses learn how to talk to each other." "Your father called this morning," Grace said carefully. Vivienne nodded, unsurprised. He left a voicemail, 3 minutes long, mostly about how I'm wasting my potential. That's not nothing, he called. It's not the same as understanding. Vivienne looked down at her coffee cup. But you know what? It's a start. He's talking to me, even if he's angry. That's more than we've had in years. Grace reached over and squeezed her hand. Vivienne let her, which was its own kind of miracle. 3 months ago, she would have flinched, deflected, found an excuse to pull away. They were both learning. Grace was learning to say no, to set boundaries, to stop setting herself on fire to keep other people warm. Vivienne was learning to let herself be held, to ask for what she needed instead of waiting to be abandoned. It was slow. It was messy. It was real. You're doing the thing again, Vivienne said. What thing? The thing where you go quiet and start analyzing me like one of your poems. Grace laughed, caught. Sorry, I was just thinking about the rooftop, how far we've come. Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, flat package wrapped in brown paper. I've been carrying this around for a while, she said. I don't know how to give it to you. I'm just going to give it to you. Grace unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a slim hardcover book, its cover worn soft at the edges. The title stamped in faded gold. The Collected Poems of Edna St. Vincent Millay. She opened it. On the title page, in Vivienne's precise, careful handwriting, was an inscription. To Grace, who taught me that being seen is not the same as being consumed. Thank you for staying. V. And tucked into the pages, marking a poem about the sea and patience, was the silver bookmark. The one Vivienne had pressed under the coffee cup that night outside the auditorium, so many months ago. Grace turned it over. On the back, in the same neat hand, were 4 words. Thank you for seeing me. She looked up. Vivienne was watching her with that guarded, vulnerable line Grace had come to recognize, the one that meant she had said something true and was braced for the worst. Grace set the book down carefully. Then she crossed the floor, sat down beside Vivienne, and pulled her into a hug. You kept it, she said, her voice thick. All this time. I kept everything, Vivienne said into her shoulder. The note you left with the coffee, the bookmark, the memory of the first time you sat with me in silence and didn't try to fix me. Grace held her tighter. I'm not going anywhere. I know. Vivienne's voice was steady, not shaking the way it might have been once. That's the strangest part. I know. Later, when the coffee had gone cold and the cookies were reduced to crumbs, they walked together down the quiet evening streets. Spring air carried the smell of wet pavement and early blossoms. The city hummed around them, softer now, less indifferent. As they passed the old bookstore, Grace paused. The window display had changed. In the center sat a single book, propped open to a page about new beginnings. Should we go in? She asked. Vivienne looked at her, and Grace saw something in her eyes she had never seen before. Not once. In all their months of careful proximity and borrowed trust. Peace. Not tonight, Vivienne said. She reached out and took Grace's hand, her fingers slipping between Grace's with an ease that still felt new, still precious. I want to keep walking, if that's okay. Grace squeezed her hand. It's more than okay. They walked on, 2 women through the lengthening shadows, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. They didn't have all the answers. Vivienne was still learning how to be a person instead of a performance. Grace was still learning how to want things without apologizing for them. But they were learning together. And that, Grace thought, was the whole point. As they turned the corner toward the coffee shop, Vivienne's hand warm in hers, Grace caught a glimpse of their reflection in a store window. 2 figures walking side by side. Not perfect, not finished, but finally beginning. At the door of the cafe, Vivienne paused. She looked at Grace, and the almost smile softened into something fuller, something that reached her eyes. Hey, she said. Yeah? Thank you. For choosing me. Grace laughed, bright and real. I'd choose you again. Every time. And when they pushed open the door, the warm light spilled out around them, and the city, for once, felt like a place where they both belonged. Well, that's where we'll leave it for today. Thank you so much for watching to the very end. I'm always curious, where in the world are you tuning in from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Let me know what you thought of the story, and I'll catch you in the next one.